More than 80 people died in minutes. The warning system activated after the water arrived. Streets became rivers before anyone understood what was happening. They had flood walls. They had dams. They believed they were protected. They were wrong. Johnstown, Pennsylvania had learned its lesson. In 1889, a dam failure killed over 2,000 people. The downtown was obliterated. Bodies were found miles downstream. The disaster became one of the deadliest floods in American history. The city rebuilt with that memory embedded in concrete and steel. By 1977, the valley had comprehensive flood control systems. 7 dams positioned upstream on tributary rivers, channel improvements throughout the Connecticut River Valley, a coordinated warning network linking weather services, emergency management, and local authorities. Engineers had calculated capacity for major flood events. The Army Corps of Engineers had certified the structures as effective protection. Residents knew the history intimately. Memorials marked where the 1889 water had reached. Families passed down stories of the South Fork Dam collapse, but they also knew the defenses were in place. The engineering was modern. The risk had been managed. Confidence replaced vigilance. Protection became assumption. The flood walls were visible reminders that the city had solved the problem. On July 19, 1977, that assumption would be tested. The system was designed for predictable spring flooding from snowmelt, events that build over days with clear warning signs. What arrived that evening was something else entirely. The storm arrived in the late afternoon over the Laurel Highlands, the steep ridges that surround Johnstown and feed water into the Connecticut River Valley. Thunderstorms formed and then stalled, locked in place by atmospheric conditions. In less than 8 hours, some areas received 12 inches of rain. Weather stations recorded intensities that exceeded historical records. The ground, already saturated from recent rainfall, couldn't absorb the volume. Small tributaries that normally carried modest flows became torrents within minutes. The watershed's geography amplified everything. Steep mountain slopes channeled water downward with almost no natural storage capacity. Narrow valleys concentrated the flow. What fell on the ridges arrived in the valley almost immediately. The 7 dams upstream were designed for gradual spring floods, seasonal events that build predictably over days. They had storage capacity for those scenarios, but this was different. The rain was too intense, too localized, too fast. The dams absorbed what they could, filling to capacity within hours. By evening, multiple tributaries were exceeding flood stage simultaneously. The Connecticut River began rising, but the real danger was coming from smaller streams that bypassed the main flood control system entirely. Drainage channels designed for moderate rainfall became express routes for massive volumes of water. Weather radar showed the storm cell wasn't moving. It was sitting directly over the valley, continuously feeding water into an overwhelmed system. Emergency managers began making calls, but the timeline for what was about to happen was already collapsing. The rain didn't build gradually. It arrived all at once, and the water had nowhere to go except down. Flash floods operate on a different timeline than river floods. River floods build over days. Water rises gradually. Evacuation happens in stages. Flash floods arrive in minutes, sometimes without any visible warning at all. At approximately 8:30 p.m., emergency sirens activated in Johnstown. The warning system was functioning exactly as designed, but the water was already moving. By the time the sirens sounded, multiple tributaries had already breached their banks and were flooding into residential areas. Residents who heard the warnings faced an impossible situation. They had minutes, not hours. Some had no warning at all. The flood didn't announce itself with slowly rising water that could be monitored. It arrived as a surge, a moving wall that transformed streets into rivers almost instantly. People attempting to evacuate found roads already submerged. Cars stalled in water that was rising by the minute. Those who tried to drive to higher ground became trapped in their vehicles as the current intensified. Some abandoned their cars and attempted to reach safety on foot, wading through water that was waist-deep and rising. Others sheltered in place, moving to upper floors as water filled their homes. But not every structure could withstand the force of the current. Buildings that sat directly in the path of channelized flow faced pressures they weren't designed to resist. The darkness made everything worse. This was happening at night. Visibility was limited to what headlights and streetlights could illuminate before the power failed. People couldn't see the water's depth. They couldn't judge the current's strength. They made decisions based on incomplete information in situations where seconds mattered. The warning came. It just came too late. The system's design assumed there would be time to act. There wasn't. Urban flooding doesn't behave like river flooding. Cities create their own hydraulics. Streets become channels. Intersections become collection points. Underground infrastructure becomes pressurized. The built environment transforms moving water into something more destructive than it would be in open terrain. In Johnstown that night, the topography of the city guided the water along specific paths. Streets that ran downslope became express routes for the flood. Water accelerated as it moved through confined spaces, picking up debris, vehicles, and anything else in its path. Cars were swept off roads and carried downstream. Some were pushed into buildings. Others were stacked against bridges, creating temporary dams that redirected the flow into areas that might have otherwise been spared. When those debris dams broke, they released surges that hit without warning. Bridges became failure points. Several collapsed under the combined stress of water pressure and accumulated debris. When a bridge failed, everything that had been caught against it was released downstream as a moving mass of wreckage. Vehicles, trees, parts of buildings, all traveling together in the current. The flood didn't flow evenly across the valley. It followed the lowest paths with concentrated force. Some neighborhoods were devastated while others, just blocks away, experienced only moderate flooding. The difference between survival and catastrophe often came down to elevation differences of just a few feet. Basements filled instantly, trapping anyone who had sheltered there. First floors were submerged. Water rose above windows, above doorways, in some cases above the first story entirely. People who had moved to upper floors found themselves isolated, surrounded by water, with no way to reach safety. And the rain continued. The storm cell remained locked in position, continuing to feed water into a system that was already overwhelmed. What had begun as flooding became something more severe. The valley had become a hydraulic system processing volumes it was never designed to handle. The rain finally stopped after midnight. The water began to recede, draining back into channels, leaving behind a landscape transformed by hours of violent flow. Dawn revealed the scale. Entire neighborhoods were unrecognizable. Buildings had been shifted off their foundations. Cars were stacked in piles or wrapped around trees. Streets were buried under feet of mud and debris. What had been familiar terrain was now a confusion of wreckage and sediment. The search began immediately. Survivors emerged from upper floors, from rooftops, from anywhere above the water line. Emergency responders moved through areas where roads had existed, navigating debris fields, checking every structure. Some people were found alive, isolated but unharmed. Others were found in basements, in vehicles, in places where the water had trapped them. Bodies were discovered downstream, sometimes miles from where people had last been seen. The current had carried victims far beyond the immediate flood zone. Recovery operations extended along the entire river system, searching areas that hadn't experienced direct flooding, but had received everything the water had transported. The official count would eventually reach 85 dead, but the number only captured confirmed fatalities. Some bodies were never recovered. Some people were simply gone, their final locations unknown. Survivors described the speed. That was the consistent element in every account. How fast it happened. How little time there had been to react. How the situation went from manageable to catastrophic in minutes. The flood hadn't given them a chance to prepare. It had simply arrived. The valley filled with emergency personnel, volunteers, equipment. The work of recovery and then rebuilding began immediately, but questions were already forming. The city had flood protection. The dams had been in place. The warning system had functioned, and 85 people had still died. Something in the understanding of risk had been wrong. The post-flood analysis was methodical. Engineers examined the dam system, the warning protocols, the intensity of the rainfall, the response times. What they documented was a failure not of engineering, but of assumptions. The flood control infrastructure had worked as designed. The dams had stored water. The channels had conveyed flow. The warning system had activated. But the design parameters had been based on historical flood patterns, events that built gradually with clear precursors. The 1977 storm didn't match those patterns. It exceeded the intensity, duration, and concentration that the system was built to handle. The 7 dams had provided protection against river flooding, but they couldn't control the small tributaries that drained directly into residential areas. The flood walls protected against the Canemo River overtopping its banks, but they didn't address water arriving from dozens of smaller streams simultaneously. The warning system assumed there would be hours of advance notice. The flash flood developed in minutes. The infrastructure had created confidence that wasn't fully warranted. Residents believed they were protected because protection was visible and documented. The city had invested in defense. That investment translated psychologically into security, but the security was partial, limited to specific scenarios. What had happened in 1889 was a dam failure, a sudden release of stored water. What happened in 1977 was a hydrological event that no dam system could have fully prevented. The two floods were fundamentally different, but they shared one element. Both had been underestimated. Johnstown rebuilt again. The flood control system was improved. Warning protocols were revised. But the central lesson remained difficult to encode into infrastructure. Protection is always conditional. Systems are designed for specific threats. When conditions exceed those parameters, the protection disappears. The river had returned, not because the defenses had failed, but because defense has limits. That understanding arrived too late for 85 people who believed they were safe.